Hi, everyone. Welcome to this presentation. Um, this presentation I prepared for our School of Graduate Studies EDGE program here at Memorial University. It was a request by somebody who attended one of the other workshops that I delivered, and they wanted to know how to generate multiple publications and conference ideas from one's research. So, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Cecile Badenhorst. I'm a professor in the adult post-secondary program in the Faculty of Education. My area of expertise is graduate and faculty research writing and doctoral education. I've published a number of books in this area and, of course, papers. Um, and if you want to read anything I've written, then contact me. And this is a picture of my little dog Coco for you today. I also have a YouTube channel where I'm going to post this, and I have at least 80 plus, maybe 90 videos on various aspects of research writing. And a good chunk of them are on the technique that I'm going to show you today, the problem, purpose statements, and questions. So please go and have a look at that for more information. And if you want to email me and I'll send you a list of the full list of videos. So the purpose of this workshop is to organize your research, a bigger research project into multiple publications and conference papers. And I want to show you a very practical technique that will help you develop a focus and direction for each writing piece. So we'll concentrate on how to communicate a bigger research project, like a dissertation, but any research project, and to communicate that research message in multiple ways. So let's begin by having a quick look at academic publishing, just to set the scene, and to bear in mind that academic writing is disciplinary focused. So, I'm speaking from my own position in a way which is in education and in qualitative or arts-based research. But I do teach this technique to students, and I teach what I'm going to show you to students who come from engineering and the sciences. And as long as you keep in mind what your discipline is, what your discipline values and what they're looking for, you can apply any of the techniques that I'm showing you here. So understanding writing and publishing is very important to understand what I'm trying to tell you today. Um, so the first thing that I wanted to mention is that journals accept different kinds of papers. Obviously, the research paper is that's the gold standard. That's what we all want to publish, a peer-reviewed research paper. And by research paper, I mean a paper that has primary data where you go out and collect data. So that's the kind of standard research paper. But journals often publish lots of other papers, conceptual or theoretical papers. Literature reviews has become a real trend. Case reports or any other kind of technical reports within education, definitely, but I'm sure in other disciplines, reports on practice, methods, methodology papers. There are lots of journals out there that publish methodology papers, but within a discipline, there are journals that would welcome these kinds of papers. Position papers where you take a stand on something, so it's more of a conceptual paper, and papers on teaching, pedagogy in your particular field. And the thing to remember is that productive writers, people who publish a lot, publish all these other kinds of papers as well. Most disciplines will have an education journal, so they publish on pedagogy in their field. So when you're looking at a journal, have a look at these other papers, look to see if they're peer reviewed or not, and you can include them in your plan for moving ahead. So there are two ways to go about selecting a journal. You write the paper and then you find a journal afterwards, or you choose the journal and you write the paper for the journal. Now, there's nothing really wrong with either method, but my preference is to target journals. And what that means is make a list of the journals that you want to publish in. Let's say we're focusing, well, on any paper that you want to write in those journals, but make a list of those journals, then go and look at the scopes and aims of the journal. Think about who reads that journal. And what I mean by this is that if you are writing a paper, if you are writing for a journal that focuses on education, then you want to make sure you are writing about education. That's the framing that you will bring to this paper. So you make a list of the journals you want to publish in, you work out the focus of the journal, you think of the audience, and then you frame that paper to meet those requirements. And it doesn't mean changing your data, it means framing the question or the problem that you're going to address to meet the needs of that audience. And the easiest way to find journals is to look at the papers you read. So whatever you're reading, that's what your collective area would be. So whatever you're reading, your research would fit into those journals, and people who read those journals would be interested. And I would also suggest is that when you've listed your journals, read papers in those journals if you haven't read them. And of course, read the scopes and aims of the journal. And then plan ahead. So, say you've decided you're going to frame a paper for a pedagogy journal, then see if you can find 3 journals that are similar, a higher education journal or another, relatively similar journal. So, you're choosing 3 and you target the one that you want to go for. If for whatever reason it gets rejected, you can move on to the next one. So then it's not this massive, derailment if your paper gets rejected. The other thing to understand about writing, and I think it's really important when it comes to moving from a dissertation into publishing, whether it's publishing a book or publishing papers from a dissertation or a thesis, is that when we write, we are always writing for an audience and a specific purpose. So when we write a thesis or a dissertation, it's for the purpose of examination, and we are writing to an audience of examiners. So their expectations are very different from a journal reader's expectations. For example, in the literature review for a PhD, what an examiner is looking to see is, have you read widely? Do you have expertise on this topic? In a journal article, that's not relevant. What a journal reader is looking for is, how does this literature set up the research that's going to follow? So there's a very different purpose. The journal reader is reading for interest. The examiner is reading for examination purposes. And that's why it's important to work out the audience when you're looking at a journal. Now, sometimes you can't work it out exactly. You just want to work it out broadly so that you can frame your paper. And sometimes journals are quite broad in their audience, and then you can frame it the way you want within that general kind of discipline of that journal. So the first step is framing a paper for a journal, and this is really taking a particular angle. And I just want to give you an example from my own research with colleagues in engineering here at Memorial, where we got a grant and we worked on a project around inclusive pedagogy. So it was an EDI project, equity, diversity, and inclusion. But we really focused on writing and reflexivity. So I brought the writing elements, and my colleagues brought the inclusive pedagogies for engineering students. The project was around a 2-week intervention. We had a before and an after survey. We had lots of intervention activities and homework and narratives written by participants at various points in the 2 week intervention. So what I mean by framing is that the papers that I ended up taking the lead on all related to either pedagogy, teaching in higher education, or writing, graduate writing in some way. So that was my framing because that was my area of expertise. My engineering colleagues looked more at engineering students, engineering learning, critical reflection in engineering, professional development for graduate students in engineering, and of course, diversity and equity and inclusiveness in engineering. So you can see their framing was different from mine because their interests were different. And I just wanted to show you as a way of an example. The other thing I wanted to show you is that, of course, we produce peer-reviewed papers and peer-reviewed book chapters. And within engineering, we produce peer-reviewed conference proceedings because that is a genre within engineering. We presented papers at conferences as well, and we tried to present the paper. So this is the way we worked it, is we would, yeah, so this is how we planned it. We would, each of us would brainstorm what we would like to work on. And then we took the lead for that paper, and we worked out where we wanted that published. We tried to present at a conference first with that particular framing of the paper, and then sent it to the journal because the conference gives you a really good opportunity to try out your ideas, to get feedback from the audience. And in just presenting it, you begin to see, well, I can tighten it up here, there, or whatever. So it's a really good way to get papers finished, is to have the journal as the end venue, but present at a conference first. But the one thing I wanted to point out is that we also published in non-peer-reviewed venues, forums, and we also published popular articles. So, on blogs and various things like that. And although people will often give you advice, oh, you mustn't waste your time publishing in non-peer-reviewed venues, I think, and I think productive writers do this, you can actually publish in those venues. Now, for me, blog posts, particularly for communities, listservs and communities of a particular research area can be extremely valuable. And if you publish the blog post after you've published the paper, then you can reference the paper and direct people to that published work. So it's a really good way to popularize things that you've done. And the non-peer-reviewed papers came out of interest groups. And again, they might not have yielded any benefits, in of themselves, but they helped us to make connections, to feed into networks, and ultimately to publish in a peer-reviewed forum. Okay, so let's move on to how to develop papers from a project. And I'm going to try and come at this from several different ways. The first way is what are research documents made of? Essentially, they are made of arguments. So we make claims, and they're around a problem, an issue that's significant, and then we provide evidence. So what our audience is looking for is whether our arguments is worthy and relevant to this particular discipline, whether the issue is significant in the sense of the so what question, right? Why do we need to know this? Why is this important? Why do research on this anyway? And then, of course, they're looking at the evidence critically to see whether or not what we are saying has any validity. Now, we often like to think that research documents are made up of facts. And in some disciplines, the arguments are really deeply hidden behind the language of objectivity. But just by identifying a research problem, we are making an argument that this is an important problem that needs to be investigated. And it's worthwhile, working out what your arguments are, especially if you're going to try and be objective, because you don't want to inadvertently cloud your claims because you don't realize that you're making an argument. So within a dissertation or a bigger research project, we make many arguments, and I've just got a few here. We make big arguments and we make small arguments all the way through. So, for example, in the literature review, the main argument we're making is for the knowledge gap and the reason why we are doing this research. So it's a rationale for why this research is important. And it's about what we know about this topic and what we don't know. And your research fills what we don't know. And that's the argument that's being made. In dissertations, we often have a conceptual framework or a theory, a theoretical argument that we're also making. If we look at this problem in this way, we will get some insight. So that's another argument we're making. The method we choose, we always need to justify it in some way. So the methodology, the research process, generally any ethical issues are all arguments that we make in a research project. And then, of course, the results, the findings, which are always linked to our research questions. So that is another set of arguments, because basically what you are arguing is the way I have collected data and analyzed data yields valid results that address this research question. So each of those, if you look at arguments as a way of dividing up your research project, each of those could be a separate paper. Each of your research questions could be a separate research paper. If the ethical issues were significant, that could be the focus of a paper. Perhaps your methodology is new. So really what I'm arguing for is that you tell these smaller stories, that you reconceptualize each paper that you want to publish and tell it as its own story. So it's coherent around a specific question or problem, and it's a smaller story within the bigger story. And the smaller stories can only be made into papers depending on the available supporting evidence and the arguments being made in the bigger project. Now, one of the things you can do if you start to worry about, well, if I'm only telling smaller stories, how does anyone see what the big story is that you can sequence papers. So you can publish, a much broader overview paper if you want to, and then focus on elements in other papers and refer to the overall description of the project. Or you could build the smaller stories into a much bigger story. So you can refer to the papers that you've published previously as a way of building this research agenda, I guess you could say. So each paper needs to have a single message, whereas a research project, a dissertation, or a thesis has multiple messages. So it could be a new take on the knowledge gap or the literature review, a different way of looking at this particular topic, a new methodology, or in addition to an old methodology. You could take as your single message one key finding or a smaller set of findings. You could look at the theory that you used, and perhaps the way you are using primary data or secondary data is different, so you could write on that. But for each one, you have to have a central focus for this smaller story. And just to give you an example of framing, I mean, this is just the abstract, and I think it's only part of the abstract of this particular paper, Charlemagne's Peaches, a case of early medieval European ecological adaptation. So this is from a medieval history workshop that I gave at some point. Um, so if you read this, you'll see that the bigger story is about Charlemagne's imperial and ecological aspirations. So it's about a bigger story on the cultivation of fruit trees that supported empire development. But the smaller story is about peaches specifically. So you could write a paper on all the different fruits and not mention peaches. But this framing is around peaches that tells the smaller story of peaches, but then can be linked to this bigger story of imperial aspirations. And you can see how this author, which I don't know, could write papers on each of the different fruits if that's what they researched. And again, here's another example of a master's thesis and how this can be divided up into three different papers. Um, so the first one, so this is about chickens and eggs, again in medieval society. So the first one is that egg production started to rise, becoming a larger component of non-aristocratic diets. So the paper would be around that. The second paper would be around women becoming more heavily involved in egg production. And then the third paper would look at dives into what we now see as a food good. So there's a conceptual element to it there. So what is a food good? What does it mean? And why has it changed? So the paper would be conceptualized around that. So that's what you're looking for. Okay, so what I want to move on to now is the problem purpose statement, the PPS&Q, which is the key technique to help you identify these smaller stories and to focus on a single message. It's a one-page technique, sometimes even just a half-page technique. You don't even have to go longer than a page. And this technique comes from Sharon Merriam, a qualitative researcher from the US. I attended one of her workshops and I wanted her to come to my university and give the same workshop. And she said to me, now that you know how to do this, take it and use it as your own. And that was many, many years ago. And the if I have to identify the one technique that anyone who's attended my workshops has said has helped them, it is this technique. But the thing to understand is that it's a work in progress. It's almost like a conversation with yourself. So you're constantly looking at it, working on it, interrogating what you're trying to do here, refining it to get it to the point where you think, okay, I can move forward with this. And people say that once you've got this worked out, you feel like the paper becomes doable. There's almost an embodied response. Okay, so conceptualizing a research article. So even though you may have already conceptualized your dissertation or your research project before you collected your data, for each paper, you need to conceptualize the research article again. And the problem purpose statement summarizes this entire research project. And once you have this clear in your mind, it's much easier to write the article. So this is what goes into the problem purpose statement. And just to emphasize again that I have lots of videos on this, so have a look at them. And I'm going through it fairly quickly here, but I have lots of videos with examples. So you need 1 to 2 sentences that identify the problem. And often what happens is that the problem is not identified as a problem. It's just identified as a statement. So to get around that, begin your problem statement sentence with the problem here is, and make sure you are articulating it as a problem. Sorry. Mm. And one of the ways into it is to write down as many problems as you can think about your research project or your dissertation. and then work out which one you want to focus on here for a specific journal. So we're just looking at 1 to 2 sentences, and you can rework that as much as you want until you're happy with it. Then a couple of sentences that identify the knowledge gap. So the problem is often the real world problem, and the knowledge gap is the academic problem. What I mean by that is the knowledge gap is what research has been conducted on this. So, what do we know? What don't we know? And how will this problem, doing research on this problem, address that knowledge gap? You're setting up the so what, why do we need to know this, and the rationale for doing this research. So, 1 to 3 sentences that provide a rationale, an academic rationale for doing this research. And often this is phrased as, research is being conducted on X, Y, and Z, but very little research has been done in this context with this cohort of people, etc., something like that. A sentence or two that provides the context for the study, the time, place, the thing being studied, and that this grounds it so that your reader knows exactly what this is about. It sounds silly to say that you need to put this in, but this is one of the things that gets left off because the researcher is so familiar with the research context that they often forget to describe it. So a sentence or two that locates the study in time and place. Now, I've put it in a particular order, but the order is really dependent on the research topic. You know, for some of you, maybe the context is really important, so that would move up, or the knowledge gap is really important, then you would begin with the knowledge gap. So how you order it will depend on your project and the logic you are developing. So one thing you do need with these three, the problem, the knowledge gap, and the context, is some kind of logic. And by that, I mean they need to connect to each other. So there needs to be some connection between the context, the problem, and the knowledge gap. That's the logic. And evidence refers to if you can provide citations that agree with you that this is an important thing to study, that there is a knowledge gap, that makes it stronger. So any citations that you can provide will be helpful. Well, it'll make your problem purpose statement stronger. Then a sentence or two about your conceptual framework or theoretical lens or whatever you want to call it. I've put this after, lower down because not all studies will have this. But you might find that your theoretical framing is the most important and move it right to the top. But this is the particular lens that you are using to look at your research project. Following the problem statement, you get a statement of purpose. The purpose of this research is to, and whatever word you use after is to will imply your methodology. And the purpose statement closes the knowledge gap and states the broad goals of the research, what you want to achieve in this project or in this paper. And this is followed by research questions. The research questions unpack the problem. They relate specifically to this problem and not other problems. And this is often where conceptualization falls down because the research questions take you off into a completely different problem. So what I suggest you do is once you've got your statement of the problem, put that ahead and develop your questions so that you're looking at the statement of the problem as you develop your questions. The research questions also give you an indication of the scope of the problem. By this, I mean, if you have 5 questions, that's going to be an enormous project. Most research papers will have max 3 questions, maybe 1, maybe 2. And the other thing to remember is they must be framed as questions, again, not as statements, and you don't want to have yes, no answers. Now, in many disciplines, you might not use questions in a paper, but I would suggest that you still develop research questions. These are overarching research questions that guide your project. So I would suggest that you develop research questions and then you develop a hypothesis or whatever it is you want to do later. It just helps you to conceptualize what you're trying to do. Remember, this is a thinking exercise, it's a pre-writing exercise. You may decide later to include this in your introduction, which I would suggest you do, but you may not. That's a completely different set of decision making. This is helping you think through how to put this paper together. So just to quickly go through an example, doctoral students, emotions and writing, and my apologies for those of you who have seen this about a million times. So many doctoral students writing dissertations experience anxiety, especially when receiving feedback. So you know this study is about doctoral students, dissertations, anxiety, feedback. There is a huge emotional investment, citation to show that although I think this, others do too, yet feedback is essential. I think this, others do too. Feedback is fundamental to learning and to producing quality writing, but it is also problematic. Now, this is not a best case problem purpose statement. Looking at this now, I would say I would need to refine that problem statement. Okay, so now we come to the knowledge gap. You know, little is known about the impact of these emotions on writing after receiving feedback. The conceptual framework set within a framework of an ethic of care, focusing on relationships and relational ontology. All right, so the purpose of this research was to explore, that means it's qualitative, exploratory, explore the emotions doctoral students experience. So experience again is qualitative when they receive feedback on their dissertation writing. So you can see that this is probably going to involve interviews. And yes, through in-depth interviews with 13 doctoral students, this project aimed to investigate what emotions doctoral students experienced when receiving feedback, how were these emotions perceived by doctoral students, and the impact of these emotions on their writing. So what you want to do is go back and say, do the questions unpack the problem? And that's where I feel like this problem needs to be refined a bit more, but does it line up with the problem? Sorry. Does the research purpose close the knowledge gap? And you want the same language to appear so that you're not changing concepts and introducing new concepts. You're refining and consolidating. So you can see it's a half a page piece of writing that is a work in progress because you can continually adjust it as you feel like you need to do. Once you've done it, this particular piece becomes a summary of other parts of the paper. So, for example, the context often becomes the introduction where you explain why you're doing this. The knowledge gap becomes the literature review. The conceptual framework will be in the literature review. The purpose becomes the methodology. The research questions become the data sections. And that's why it's important to state them as questions because they can help you organize those sections as well. Okay. So once you've got your PPS&Q, you can begin to build other things. For example, if you want to write the abstract for the paper, you just need to add a sentence or two more about the methodology and a sentence or two about the key findings or results, and that gives you a very strong abstract. If you want to work out your arguments, then you take a position on the problem. You say, well, we should provide support for students because they experience anxiety when they get feedback. So there I'm taking a stand on that problem. So that would be my arguments. So from the problem purpose statement, you can work out the many other layers that go into writing a paper. And the problem purpose statement should ideally appear in the introduction to give the reader an overview of what you intend to do in the paper, because that will meet reader expectations. Um, and that's something that I never mentioned is that the problem purpose statement, the components that I've given you, like the problem, the knowledge gap, the context, the conceptual framework, the purpose, and the research questions, those all meet reader expectations. That's what an academic reader is looking for. So if you develop the problem purpose statement, you are meeting those requirements. So when it comes to moving from a thesis into papers or even a book, so it would be book chapters, you need to use your thesis as a source text. So not, people try to take a chapter and then publish that chapter. And because that sounds like it should be easy, but actually it isn't easy. And if you do what I suggest with the problem purpose statements, and then you can take bits and pieces from the thesis, but you're shaping it around your new framing. It's much easier like that. Sometimes you do have to do additional reading, particularly if you framed it in a slightly different way from the way you did it in the thesis. Then you might have to read a bit more of the literature around the way you framed it. But what you'll find is that if you try and take a chapter directly from your thesis, this is what my experience is from students, is that they get stuck and then they end up not writing because it's too difficult because it was written for a different audience and for a different purpose. However, if you have your new framing and then you're taking bits and pieces, it's much easier to do that and you can do it really quickly. And not only that, it's more enjoyable because you're creating it around this new framing. So you're not rehashing what you did before, especially after a thesis, which can be quite exhausting. Okay, so just a few points about writing for a journal that I wanted to add. Some journals are highly specialized, and others are cross-disciplinary and more general, and others will have, a disciplinary audience, but might be quite broad. So for each, you need to think about how much you will need to explain about the different components in the problem purpose statements. The example I'm going to give you here is national or international journals. If I'm writing about doctoral students in Canada, then if I'm aiming my paper at a local journal, a domestic journal, a national journal, then I know that the readers will understand the doctoral process here. However, if I'm writing for a journal in the UK, where the doctoral process is completely different, then I have to explain exactly how things work here. So this is just for your information, the general components of a research paper. You would have the abstract, keywords. I always put the keywords in because when you are looking at this, you are constantly checking your conceptualization. So the abstract will essentially be made up of the problem purpose statement. When you look at the keywords, do the keywords reflect the key concepts in the abstract? In the introduction, is your problem purpose statement in that introduction? Methods and methodology, it depends on the discipline. Sometimes those are different sections, sometimes they're not. The literature review could also be included in the introduction. Data presentation, where you actually present the results of your analysis, and then findings or results, where you begin to draw conclusions on the close findings. In the discussion, what you're doing is you're taking your close findings and you're comparing it to the literature from your literature review, and you're saying, now that I've done this, what does my research contribute? How does it compare and what does it contribute to the literature? And then you're also drawing meta conclusions in the sense that you're taking a step back and saying, okay, I've got these close findings. I've put this back into the literature and compared it. Now what can I say? So what are your overall conclusions, if you want to call it that? And then any acknowledgements, if you have, group members that helped you along the way, and of course, whatever references and citations. Last point here is that, so what people always ask me, how many pages for this, how many pages for that? So I'm putting in pages here, but what I want you to know is that this is totally arbitrary because it really depends on your discipline, it depends on the journal, it depends on the type of paper you're writing. But what's important actually is the weighting, especially when it comes to a research article. Now, obviously, if you were writing a conceptual paper, it would be completely different. But the introduction, about half a page, the literature review, 1 page, I would say 2 pages is too much. The methods, 1 page, the results, 3 pages, the discussion, 3 pages. So you can see the weighting of the paper is with the results and the discussion. That's what your academic reader wants to see in a research paper. Okay. So just some tips on publishing, things I've learned about publishing. Your paper must be interesting and it must be contributing something. So think about that. It's not just a matter of taking what you've got and putting it into a paper and sending it off. Like, what interested you about this? What do you find fascinating? That's what you need to communicate. The academic reader is saying, why should I read this? Why do I need to spend my time reading this? Why is this research important? That's what you have to articulate. Frame the paper for the journal audience, and this would mean reading papers in the journal, joining conversations. If there are other papers on this topic, refer to them, join that conversation. Work out the argument in your mind, in your own mind, so that it's clear for you. And the more specific and detailed you're writing, rather than abstract, vague writing, readers will find that much more interesting. Persevere and learn from rejection. If you get a revise and resubmit, then revise and resubmit. You've had 2 experts, sometimes even 3, go through your paper and give you feedback. So there must be something in there that you can use that will help get it published. And if the journal's saying resubmit, that's a win. People are often surprised because my area is writing that I get papers rejected, but I get papers rejected all the time. Sometimes because I haven't done my homework on the journal, sometimes because I'm trying to push an argument without, really providing the evidence that I need. Sometimes because I haven't articulated what I wanted to say. So, I always revise and resubmit, and sometimes it takes several rounds of resubmissions before it gets published. So I wouldn't, don't get caught up in the, well, I'm obviously not good enough if I don't get my paper accepted immediately. And what I would suggest is that you co-publish with someone, with a supervisor or a colleague or, classmates, because it helps you to distance yourself from the process and to see it as, any other day at the office kind of thing. Separate writing from editing because it's the editing that can make your critical voice really strong. And I've got lots of videos on that. And draw strong conclusions because that's what your reader's looking for. Your reader's looking to see, what did you find? What did you find and what are you saying about this? Okay, this is I've just put this in to show you the paper that I have had published on this, which explains it in much more detail. So if you're interested, you can find that or email me and I'll send it to you. Moving forward, go towards this with an expansive process in the sense that you brainstorm possible papers, you create a list of journals, you don't have to publish in all of them, but rather than looking for one and writing one paper to fit that one journal. Use free writing. It's a really good technique on how you can shape or frame your paper. Develop problem purpose statements for the papers you think you could produce from your data. All right, I think that is it from me. I hope you go forth and publish many papers. Thank you very much for listening.